the most detailed alien abduction ever recorded. And the alien medical exam was real. In the eerie quiet of a lonely Maryland highway, Steve Kilburn's life was changed forever by something he could neither see clearly nor explain. What began as a vague, creeping sense of dread became one of the most compelling and medically verifiable alien abduction cases ever documented. Through hypnotic regression therapy and careful investigation by famed UFO researcher Budd Hopkins, Kilburn's fragmented memories transformed into a detailed and disturbing account of alien contact, medical experimentation, and psychological trauma. His story is more than just a strange tale. It is a chilling exploration of the limits of memory, the fragility of reality, and the haunting power of the unknown. If you found Steve Kilburn's story as haunting and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to subscribe for more chilling encounters, hidden truths, and unexplained phenomena. It all began with an uneasy feeling that would haunt Steve Kilburn every time he passed a certain stretch of road, until it eventually unraveled into something far more disturbing. Steve Kilburn's journey into the unknown began not with a dramatic sighting, but with an ordinary drive and an unshakable feeling. Every time he traveled the same stretch of Route 40 between Baltimore and Frederick, Maryland, something deep inside him recoiled. There were no flashing lights in the sky, no strange objects hovering above his car, just a creeping dread that clung to him like a fog. At first, he chalked it up to anxiety or an overactive imagination, but the fear persisted. It wasn't loud or frantic, it was quiet, steady, and it didn't go away. Over the years, Kilburn tried to ignore it. He changed his routines, avoided late-night drives, and even began questioning his own sanity. But deep down, he suspected there was a reason something was hidden, something he had forgotten. Eventually, he came across the work of Budd Hopkins, a well-known UFO researcher and author of Missing Time, whose investigations into alien abductions had helped uncover suppressed memories in numerous individuals. Intrigued but cautious, Kilburn reached out. Their first meeting was informal. Kilburn wasn't claiming to have been abducted. He wasn't even sure anything had happened. He just had a feeling, and a gap in his memory he couldn't explain. Hopkins listened carefully. What stood out to him was not just the missing time, but the consistency of emotion that accompanied Kilburn's vague recollections. Fear, confusion, and a sense of physical vulnerability that didn't align with any known trauma from Kilburn's past. Hopkins suggested regression hypnosis, a method he had used with other potential abductees to uncover deeply buried memories. Kilburn agreed reluctantly. The first session, guided by psychologist Dr. Gerard Franklin, was tentative, but it opened a door. Fragmented images and sensations began to emerge. Kilburn described driving home late one night from his girlfriend's house during his college years, when he suddenly felt like he was being watched. A few miles later, he became overwhelmed with confusion and fear. He wasn't sure how or why, but he found himself outside his vehicle, without remembering getting out. From there, the memories became stranger, a sense of paralysis, a force pulling at his body, figures in the shadows behind a chain-link fence. Hopkins recognized these details from other abduction accounts, but he didn't prompt or lead Kilburn. He simply observed. What unfolded over the next few months would become one of the most detailed and medically significant abduction cases on record. Kilburn's experience defied typical science fiction cliches, lacking dramatic spaceship chases or Hollywood-style aliens. Instead, his story was rooted in subtle fear, psychological fragmentation, and physical sensations that felt real and terrifying. His account unfolded like a suppressed trauma, not a fantastical tale. What began as an unexplained sense of dread eventually unraveled into something much deeper, a chilling encounter with forces beyond comprehension. And it all started with a road he couldn't stop dreading, and a truth his mind wasn't sure it wanted to remember. To make sense of this growing dread, Kilburn turned to hypnotic regression, an unconventional tool that would open the door to long-buried memories. Steve Kilburn's first hypnotic regression in May 1978 marked the beginning of a terrifying unraveling. For years, he had felt the faint but persistent echo of something lost, something buried beneath layers of fear and confusion. With the help of psychologist Dr. Gerard Franklin, he began to explore the depths of his subconscious, What emerged wasn't a single clear memory, but a slow and harrowing reconstruction of a night in 1973 that he had all but forgotten. That night had begun like many others. Kilburn was driving home from his girlfriend's house in the early hours of the morning, cruising along a familiar stretch of Route 40. There was nothing outwardly unusual, no strange lights, no missing time, no dramatic visual cues, but there was a feeling, one that had stalked him for years every time he passed that area. During hypnosis, Kilburn described it as a presence, a chilling awareness that someone or something was watching him from the darkness. Then came the confusion. He couldn't recall stopping the car, but he somehow found himself outside of it, on foot, vulnerable and disoriented. There was a moment, a blank space where he should have remembered turning off the engine, opening the door and stepping out, but it was gone, replaced by the overwhelming sensation that he was no longer in control of his own body. Something had seized him not physically with hands, but as if a clamp had latched onto his torso, manipulating him like a puppet. The grip was cold, unrelenting, and completely foreign. As the regression went deeper, Kilburn started to remember things more clearly. He saw a chain-link fence nearby, behind which strange human-shaped figures stood motionless. They were dressed in tight black suits that shimmered under bright, unnatural light. He couldn't make out their faces, but their presence filled him with dread. They didn't speak, but he heard a voice inside his mind, an alien consciousness pushing thoughts into his head, instructing him to move toward the fence. Kilburn's panic was palpable. Under hypnosis, he would tremble uncontrollably, whisper incoherent phrases, or suddenly burst into tears. The emotional reaction was so severe that Dr. Franklin occasionally had to pause the session. These weren't the responses of someone spinning a tale, they were the involuntary convulsions of a man reliving trauma. Then came the wrench-like device, a strange, mechanical instrument that clamped around his chest and back. It didn't pierce his skin, but he felt it pressing inward, almost as though it were scanning or extracting something. The sensation was not just physical, it was invasive, violating on a level beyond comprehension. What struck Dr. Franklin and Budd Hopkins most was the coherence and consistency of Kilburn's account. The details he offered about the sensations, the setting, and the emotional confusion remained steady across sessions. His fear wasn't abstract, it was grounded in the bodily responses of someone who had experienced real terror. And the implication was chilling. Kilburn hadn't just remembered something strange, he had remembered something done to him. However, this first session was just the beginning of a deeper exploration. Months later, a second regression revealed even more haunting and detailed recollections. By the time Steve Kilburn sat down for his second hypnosis session with Dr. Aphrodite Clamar, 7 months after the first, his nerves were raw, but his curiosity had deepened. The first session had opened a floodgate of unsettling images and emotions, but what emerged in this second session was something far more detailed, vivid, and disturbing. As Dr. Clamar guided him back into a hypnotic state, Kilburn's fragmented recollections sharpened into clearer, more terrifying sequences. He first remembered a moment during the drive, when the clock on his dashboard suddenly stopped. The digital display froze, casting a soft blue glow that seemed disconnected from time itself. A second later, he felt the car lurch violently to the right, as if an invisible hand or some unseen magnetic force had taken hold of the vehicle. The tyres screeched against the roadside gravel, and despite his hands gripping the wheel, Kilburn felt powerless to steer or stop. That was the moment he saw the lights. Hovering above the treetops were several orbs, glowing with a white-blue intensity. But what terrified Kilburn most was the way they moved, jerking diagonally in midair, stopping dead, then darting to new positions with no sound or visible propulsion. No man-made aircraft could move like that. These lights were not just watching him, they were targeting him. Once again, the chain-link fence appeared in his memory. It had become a symbolic threshold in his psyche, a line between the known world and the terrifying unknown. As he stared into it during the regression, Kilburn gasped. "I wasn't supposed to see this," he whispered. Something inside him screamed to look away, but he couldn't, and that's when the grotesque figures emerged. Kilburn described them as tall, pale, and rubbery-skinned, like damp latex, stretched over elongated limbs and bulbous heads. Their eyes were large, black, and unblinking. They had no hair, no noses, and only slits where mouths might have been. Yet despite their alien form, he felt their thoughts entering his mind. They communicated not through sound, but through intent. He knew instantly what they were feeling, and worse, he knew they were evaluating him. One stood apart. Kilburn believed this was the leader, distinguishable not by appearance but by presence. He recalled a strange, silent argument taking place, telepathic tension, as the entities debated what should be done with him. He sensed disagreement, hesitation, even something like confusion. This was not a routine procedure for them. Kilburn wasn't just another test subject. Something about his presence troubled them. Then the examination began. A white light filled the room, brighter than any surgical lamp, but strangely soothing. From the ceiling, a thin needle descended slowly toward his abdomen. At the same time, panels on the floor retracted, revealing strange instruments that rose mechanically around him. He was aware of his body, aware of the intrusion, but he didn't panic. A dull numbness washed over him, almost like sedation. He was still scared deep down, but it felt like something was keeping the fear hidden. The session ended with Kilburn trembling, drenched in sweat, but eerily calm. The memories had returned in terrifying detail, yet what haunted him most wasn't what he had remembered, but the lingering feeling that there was still more he hadn't yet uncovered. What truly set Kilburn's account apart, however, was the unexpected medical accuracy of his memories, verified by a real neurosurgeon. Steve Kilburn's story, while already rich in emotional and psychological complexity, reached a new level of credibility after his third hypnosis session, this time due to its surprising alignment with medical science. After Kilburn described a clear and detailed memory of what he believed was a physical exam done by aliens, he was sent to Dr. Paul Cooper, an experienced brain surgeon, for evaluation. Dr. Cooper's role was not to prove or disprove the existence of extraterrestrials. He was asked only to evaluate the physical and neurological descriptions Kilburn had given under hypnosis to assess whether the bodily sensations and reactions he described had any basis in known medical science. What Cooper found shocked him. Kilburn's descriptions of pain, pressure, numbness, and involuntary movement closely matched what a trained physician would expect in scenarios involving neural stimulation, spinal response, and cranial pressure. He described, in alarming detail, sensations akin to vagus nerve activation, limbic system disruption, and even temporal lobe interference regions of the brain and nervous system that control memory, fear, and physical sensation. The accuracy of his descriptions was not superficial. It wasn't merely "my arm hurt" or "my chest tingled." Kilburn explained, for example, a buzzing sensation that began at the base of his skull and travelled down his spine, ending in his legs, a classic sign of neurological conduction. He also noted a numb, almost magnetic sensation in his temples, which Cooper recognized as a symptom reported in transcranial stimulation experiments. Crucially, Kilburn had no formal education in anatomy, medicine, or biology. He was not a medical professional, nor was he known to study such subjects in his spare time. There was no reasonable explanation for how he could have fabricated such detailed physiological reactions, unless he had either experienced them firsthand or somehow had an intimate understanding of advanced medical procedures. For Dr. Cooper, this was a turning point. While he stopped short of endorsing the alien hypothesis, he stated on record that Kilburn's physical reactions were medically valid and internally consistent. They did not resemble dream logic, fantasy, or random hallucination. Instead, they mirrored patterns observed in patients undergoing real surgical procedures, neurological tests, or trauma-based treatments. This validation from a medical expert gave Steve Kilburn's case a level of gravity that few alien abduction stories ever achieve. It moved the narrative out of the realm of the purely psychological or speculative and into something far more difficult to dismiss, a medically plausible sequence of events experienced by a man with no reason to invent them. Even Budd Hopkins, who had investigated dozens of abduction accounts, noted that Kilburn's case stood apart, not just because of its emotional rawness or consistency across sessions, but because of its anatomical precision. If abduction stories often suffer from being too vague or fantastical, Kilburn's was the opposite, disturbingly specific, biologically accurate, and grounded in a kind of detail that defied coincidence. Whether one accepts the alien explanation or not, Steve Kilburn's story challenges us to consider the possibility that something extraordinary happened to him, something that reached deep into both his mind and body. Strangely, throughout all of this, Kilburn felt as though he was never meant to remember, and that remembering came at a cost. Steve Kilburn's profound struggle with memory, specifically the visceral sense that he was not meant to remember, is perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of his entire case. It wasn't merely that certain details were forgotten, rather, there appeared to be an active force preventing recollection, a wall in his mind that wasn't just neurological, but existential. Each attempt to penetrate that barrier, even under the safety and guidance of professional hypnosis, resulted in physical and emotional distress. This wasn't simple forgetfulness. It was fear encoded into the structure of his consciousness. During regression sessions, Kilburn often recoiled when approaching key moments in the narrative. His voice would tremble, his body would tighten. He would stop speaking entirely, whispering phrases like, "I can't go there," or "They said I'd die." His reactions bore the marks not of performance, but of trauma, his subconscious mind treating memory as if it were a threat, and in many ways, that may be precisely what it was. This aligns with a phenomenon often reported in abduction accounts, known as memory blocks, where individuals cannot recall specific events. Victims commonly describe periods of missing time, during which they are conscious enough to sense fear or discomfort, but unable to recall specific events. Some even report hearing internal voices warning them not to remember. In the most chilling accounts, abductees claim that these blocks were deliberately placed by the beings themselves, either through psychic means, drugs, or technology we do not yet understand. Kilburn's experiences are no exception. His memories seemed buried not just by time, but by design. This brings us to a disturbing crossroads. If his memories were fabricated either consciously or unconsciously, why do they follow such precise neurological and psychological patterns? How could someone with no formal training describe clinical sensations, such as vagus nerve stimulation, synaptic overload, or sedation-like calm, that match real biological responses? Why would imaginary scenarios consistently produce trauma responses identical to PTSD? On the other hand, if these memories are real, the implications are even more unsettling. Who or what has the capacity to not only abduct a human being, but suppress their memories of the event so effectively that the mere act of recalling them causes psychological pain? We are not just talking about trauma here, we are talking about control of the body, of the mind, of consciousness itself. Whether this control was technological or psychological, its effect was the same: total domination of memory. Kilburn's story forces us to confront a broader question. Are there entities, natural or otherwise, capable of altering human perception at its core? Could trauma, in this context, be more than just emotional injury? Could it be instilled deliberately to protect or conceal information from the victim and those who would later ask questions? In the end, Kilburn's struggle with memory may be the most credible part of his entire story, because memory doesn't lie the way stories can, and his mind, desperately trying to protect him or obey some otherworldly command, seemed to know something too dangerous to say out loud. His story, as strange as it sounds, fits an eerie pattern found in many other alien abduction cases around the world. Steve Kilburn's case gains even more significance when viewed not as an isolated incident, but as part of a vast, interconnected body of global abduction accounts that stretch across decades, continents, and cultural boundaries. His experience, with its disjointed memories, psychological trauma, medical anomalies, and eerily detailed descriptions of non-human entities, aligns with an astonishing number of similar narratives, reported by individuals who have never met, never communicated, and often come forward reluctantly. In the UFO research community, these consistencies have not gone unnoticed. Investigators like Budd Hopkins, David Jacobs, and John Mack have devoted years to compiling and comparing these accounts. Hopkins, in particular, focused on the phenomenon of missing time, periods of lost consciousness or memory that often correspond with moments of high strangeness. In his book Missing Time, 1981, Hopkins outlined a template that would appear over and over again, a a person driving or walking alone, suddenly overwhelmed by fear or confusion, strange lights in the sky, a sense of paralysis or loss of control, the appearance of beings that communicate telepathically, intrusive medical procedures, and afterward, an aching sense that something profound had occurred just beyond the reach of conscious recall. Kilburn's case fits this template almost too well, but what makes his story especially compelling is the early timeline. His experiences, and his recounting of them under hypnosis, occurred before the widespread cultural saturation of alien abduction tropes through film and television. Unlike modern cases that might be accused of copying from The X-Files, Communion, or Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Kilburn's recollections emerged in a cultural vacuum, devoid of media influence, and well before these motifs became household narratives. Moreover, the medical realism of his account sets it apart. Many abductees described vague sensations or symbolic imagery, but Kilburn spoke with anatomical specificity. His descriptions of neurological sensations, physical manipulation, and psychological numbing were so precise that a neurosurgeon, Dr. Paul Cooper, affirmed they reflected real human neurological responses. Again, for a layman with no medical training to recount such phenomena with textbook accuracy defies coincidence. This anatomical consistency is echoed in other abduction cases. For instance, multiple abductees have independently reported similar tools: long, silver rods, descending needles, and strange lights that scan the body. Many speak of rooms that are sterile and metallic, beings that move with machine-like precision, and procedures that resemble medical experiments more than acts of communication. Skeptics often argue that hypnosis introduces suggestion, and that abductees might be feeding off one another's accounts. But many of the earliest abduction cases, including that of Betty and Barney Hill, 1961, Travis Walton, 1975, and Steve Kilburn, 1973, with hypnosis beginning in 1978, predate the mainstream narratives that skeptics claim influenced them. These cases often come with physical evidence, radiation readings, bodily scars, objects embedded under the skin, or, in Kilburn's case, missing time corroborated by vehicle anomalies and intense emotional trauma. Steve Kilburn's account is not an outlier. It is a foundational example of a repeating pattern that challenges our understanding of memory, reality, and the possibility of non-human contact. Whether interpreted as literal truth, psychological metaphor, or something in between, the recurrence and consistency of these stories point to something genuine, something that continues to haunt the boundaries of human experience. In the end, Kilburn was left with more questions than answers, forced to live with the unsettling truth that something truly unexplainable had happened. What makes Steve Kilburn's story so compelling, and, in many ways, so human, is that he never sought to become the face of alien abduction lore. He didn't write a book, he didn't go on a speaking tour. He never appeared on late-night talk shows, spinning his experience into a sensational story for public consumption. In an era where claims of the extraordinary often come with motives of fame or profit, Kilburn quietly stepped away from the spotlight, choosing instead to process his experience in private. That restraint, that refusal to sensationalize, lends his story a quiet credibility. After each regression session, Kilburn emerged, shaken, but somehow validated. There was a kind of relief in finally understanding the source of his long-standing fear and anxiety, the recurring nightmares, the irrational dread of certain highways, the moments of unexplained panic. The regressions helped him make sense of these symptoms. They gave his suffering context. But with that relief came a darker weight, the realization that his memories, now partially restored, were more disturbing than he had imagined. He had not simply hallucinated or misunderstood. Something had happened, and now he had to live with the consequences of knowing. Kilburn's reaction mirrors that of many other so-called abductees who, rather than embracing the experience as a badge of uniqueness, are instead haunted by it. They speak of feeling isolated, misunderstood, or psychologically fragmented. For Kilburn, the sessions did not bring closure. They brought clarity, and that clarity came at a price. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the boundaries of science and perception. Our current understanding of memory, trauma, and consciousness is still incomplete. The human mind is capable of astonishing things, creating false memories, repressing real ones, and experiencing vivid hallucinations that feel utterly real. But it is also capable of recording trauma with uncanny precision, storing information in emotional responses rather than visual images. Kilburn's case sits precisely at this intersection between science and mystery, between verifiable neurology and inexplicable experience. His account challenges us to remain open without surrendering to fantasy. It asks us to examine the evidence, the physiological reactions, the consistency of detail, and the corroboration by medical professionals without assuming we know the full picture. It's not an appeal for belief, but for inquiry, and perhaps most importantly, it reframes the phenomenon of alien abduction not as fringe hysteria, but as a deeply personal, deeply disturbing encounter that defies easy classification. In the end, Steve Kilburn's story is not just about aliens or spaceships. It's about what happens when reality breaks down, when something steps into the familiar world and rewrites its rules, if only for a moment. And it's about how a single human being tries to make sense of the fragments left behind. His silence, his reluctance, and his emotional honesty all serve as reminders that the most powerful stories are often the ones whispered, not shouted. In conclusion, Steve Kilburn's alien abduction account remains one of the most compelling, emotionally authentic, and medically detailed in the literature of the unexplained. It offers no definitive proof of extraterrestrial life, yet neither can it be dismissed without doing violence to the witness's credibility and the corroborative elements that accompany his memories. The true power of Kilburn's story lies not in its answers, but in its questions. In a world obsessed with certainty, his experience reminds us that some truths remain hidden not because they are false, but because they dwell in the deep shadows of human understanding. Thank you for watching, and remember, the truth may be closer than you think. Subscribe now so you never miss what comes next.